Okay, welcome everyone. This is Yoga Talks Podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Thank you very much for listening. How's everybody doing? Did you have a good holiday? I hope so. I got some time to get away. Did you rest? Remember, I said we're going to rest. I'm going to rest. If you're going to rest, did we rest? I did. I left. I had to leave Brooklyn, though. I left Brooklyn. I spent a few days in Virginia with my in-laws. North Garden, Virginia. It's just outside of Charlottesville. They have some property up there, and it is just spectacular. The girls get to run around, they get to pick berries, and it's a really wonderful place. I don't think that my family's been listening to the podcast, honestly. So I don't know if they're listening, but if they are, I had a great time. It was nice to see you guys. And I had time to reflect on some things, and I want to take a moment to apologize to the listeners of this podcast, or at least some of the listeners, I should say, because I made comments about the criticisms that have been coming in about me, which are always the same criticisms about how I'm always interrupting people and interjecting myself and not listening very well. And I made sort of a defense of myself. I mean, I made sub-admissions, but then I was also pretty defensive about it, I think. And I want to give a shout out to Kate and also Ryan from Unrolled Podcast. I don't know if you guys know that. There's a great podcast called Unrolled Podcast. You can look it up. And Kate and Ryan, they have a very intimate podcast where they just sit and talk about stuff, and it's not at all scripted. It's very raw, and I feel like I'm right there in the room with them, and I really like it. And Kate mentioned my comments. And she's someone who, like, the world of inclusivity and trauma sensitivity in yoga, that's like her wheelhouse. And she basically said that she agreed with the criticisms, which I was like, oh no, really? Kate thinks I'm an oppressive jerk too? Oh no. And I guess I went and I listened back, and I can see it. I can see why when I do that in this context, in dialogue with me and a woman, it has all the stuff around it, you know? Now, I will say that tendency of mine to like interrupt people and be self-consumed, that's not specific to just women. I do that to men as well as women. But I do acknowledge that in some ways it is different. In particular in this context, the role I'm playing in this podcast. And, you know, I mean, people accuse me not of being humble. And all I want to say is that having a podcast, it takes a fair amount of nerve, and there's nothing really humble about it. Like, choosing to have a podcast is already not an act of humility, you know, that I think I have anything to say. You know, I'm not even just going to the conversations. I'm just taking this time to do these intros like I have something to say, you know. But as I have said, I want this to not be a contrived or scripted situation. I'm a writer and a trained performer, and I could easily script up these intros. I could write tight questions. I could ask the question and just wait until they stop talking and then ask the next question. I have the discipline to do that, but I don't want to do that. And the other thing that Kate said in my defense, after she agreed with the fact that she thought my behavior was maybe unconscious, but still not that cool, she said that if it's going to be intimate and raw, then it's going to have flaws. And that's kind of thing is either it's going to be totally real and raw, and I'm going to have the freedom to let my unconscious behaviors be seen or heard, I guess, in this instance, or I'm going to like try tightly constructed and like try to X all that out and get rid of it. And that's what I'm not going to do. So I'm not going to do that. And, you know, sometimes also people are upset because they feel like I'm cutting someone off and they want to hear what they're going to say. And in a small amount of defense there, I will say that sometimes when I'm doing that, it is because yoga teachers have scripts. And if you haven't heard that yoga teacher script before and they're saying the script and you want to hear what's happening next in the script, you're like, oh my God, I want to hear what's next. Then I totally get it. You're like, why did he interrupt? I want to hear what he was going to say. But if I've been sort of researching someone a little bit before I bring them on the podcast and I've heard them say the exact same thing in like another podcast or in some interview, like I know that's their script. Sometimes I'm going to interrupt them because I want to try to get us off script, you know. Now, having said that, the really thing, see, I just went right back into it. I got defensive again, didn't I? See, these are really deeply ingrained things, you know. I've worked hard to try to be a man who's not carrying on these legacies. Like, I come from a family of men who lose their tempers and yell, and I've really, that's been like a life goal of mine to not carry that on. So in those moments when I do that, in those moments, in those conversations, when I interrupt the women that I'm speaking to, in that moment, I really am not intentionally like shutting anybody down. I'm just enjoying the conversation. Sometimes I'm excited. Sometimes I want to contribute. But at the same time, even if I'm not conscious of it, if you step back and look at it, you could see that it is emblematic of these deeply ingrained dynamics, you know? So I'm sorry, and I'm going to do better. I'm going to really work on it and be more conscious when I'm having these conversations about being more poised. And if I'm going to interject, I just have to pick that moment more carefully and not interrupt people in the same way that I have been. So for those of you who made those comments, even though some of you were kind of mean to me, I just want you to know that I've taken it to heart and I'm going to do my best. Now, I want to also say that these podcasts do get recorded in advance. So like the podcasts for this month have already been recorded before I'm telling you this. So I think I did pretty good this month. It wasn't quite the same thing, but give me some time and you have my word. I do not want to be someone who is unconsciously perpetuating dynamics that are not mutual. Okay, so what else? I want to plug my stuff, jbrownyogavideo.com. I know I mentioned that we're going to put out some video segments to answer the questions of those of you who've been taking the online course, Gentle is the New Advanced. Those are coming. Also, the practice video is out there. So check that out at jbrownyogavideo.com. And then today's talk. Today's talk is with Diane Bruni. And Diane just swung through town. She was here to do something. She mentions in a podcast that's not in my brain right now. But she emailed me and said, oh, I was wondering if you're going to be around. I want to come take your class. And so I sort of on a whim said, hey, great, I'm going to be there. And if you're not doing anything after class and you want to hang around, you know, maybe you want to record a podcast or we could have some dinner. But it was very up in the air. I wasn't really sure if it was going to happen, but I brought the equipment just in case. And then she came and we had a really lovely practice. And then she was game. So we recorded this in the yoga center, which you'll hear at the start, which is awesome. I hadn't done that before. And also I hadn't recorded a podcast right after having a yoga practice with them before, which was kind of great. And then we actually did go have dinner after this. Like, the conversation just carried on. It's kind of long, so we're going to get to it. But I do want to say that, you know, Diane comes clean on some pretty big stuff that's been out there in the yoga world in terms of what we're doing in our yoga practice. She was one of the early dispatches from Matthew Remsky's Wawadia project, and I didn't know all the stuff about her that we learn about her, and it's a pretty incredible story. And I think it's a cautionary tale. So let's get to it. Let's listen to me and Diane Bruni on an intimate Sunday evening. Diane, this is really fun for me. I've never recorded a podcast here at Abhyasa Yoga Center. And normally this time, this like Sunday night time after my last class, this is when I'm like here by myself. It's always quiet like this. It's raining out there, and I like have my own sort of quiet, special time. And I've never recorded a podcast during that time. So I'm really enjoying sitting down here with you right now. And, you know, when you reached out to me a couple of days ago, and you said you were coming into town and you wanted to make sure I was teaching my class today, I didn't recognize your name at first, honestly. I didn't put together. I knew who you were, but I didn't put you to your name in that moment.
Okay.
And then afterwards, I was like, what's that? I've heard that name before. And when I looked, I was like, oh, she's the one who was part of one of those early dispatches from Matthew Remsky's Wawadia project.
That's right.
I watched that video, and it was very powerful, you know,
Yeah.
and courageous. I thought it was an incredibly courageous thing. And just if anyone's listening to this doesn't know what I'm talking about, and you'll correct me when you talk about it if I'm not correctly giving a summation, but what I remember of it was that you had been a very well-established Ashtanga yoga teacher in Canada, and you had come down with some injuries, and then in the process of healing those injuries, had to admit to yourself that things that you had been doing in practice caused those injuries.
Yeah.
And then you spoke out publicly about that, which was not easy given you being so already identified as a senior Ashtanga teacher, and then potentially calling into question something that is very dear to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, before I hear about that, because that's where I wanted to start, but before, I'm just wondering, did you start as an Ashtanga practitioner, or did you have some other sort of yoga practice before you came to that?
My first yoga teacher was Yogi Bhajan.
So you were a Kundalini person.
Yeah, that was my first exposure to yoga. I went to a white tantric yoga weekend with Yogi Bhajan. That was the very first time I did yoga. I was 19 years old.
Wow, and what was that like?
It changed my life.
Yeah.
And
how so? What do you remember, like as a 19-year-old? What was that experience? What is your remembrance of it?
I remember walking out of the workshop that first Friday night and looking up into the night sky and wondering what had just happened to me, because I was in a very altered state of awareness. And I had to keep asking myself if I had done any drugs.
Ah, yes.
And no, I had not done any drugs. Wow. And it was the practice that he guided us through that took me to that altered state. And that was a pivotal moment in my life.
That it was possible that you could alter your state.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so at 19 you go to a Kundalini white tantra, and was it like one of those ones where it's like lots of people and you do
Hundreds
it for like 45 minutes, Bastrika for like 45 minutes, like that?
That's right. Hundreds of people all wearing their white turbans and swords and sitting on their sheepskin rugs.
And it was ecstatic, I bet.
It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. And then I continued to practice with the Kundalini community in Toronto for the next 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
Every day I went to their ashram and practiced with them. And then I started becoming more involved in their community.
I see. And were you just a practitioner? Did you at some point you become a teacher, a Kundalini teacher, or just practitioner?
No, I never became a teacher of Kundalini yoga. While I was practicing Kundalini yoga, I also then went to Shiatsu school, and I became a Shiatsu therapist. And during that time, I met a woman who introduced me to Iyengar yoga.
Oh, okay.
And at that point, the Kundalini yoga in community in Toronto was going through some changes, and I was open to trying something new. So I went to Iyengar yoga classes for another 7 or 8 years.
So that was just out of curiosity. It wasn't like you were unhappy with Kundalini, but you just wanted to try something
I
different.
just tried something else. And what I found from the Iyengar classes was that I learned a lot about my body that I didn't know from taking the Kundalini yoga. So it was a really different practice.
Yeah, I've always said that. Like, to me, Kundalini yoga is not even so much of like a hatha practice. It's like pranayama kriya.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
exactly.
To me, more than what I think of as a hatha practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it
you
was,
started doing a Iyengar practice?
Yeah, and I was fortunate to have connected with a woman who had just come back from living with Iyengar for 2 years in Pune as soon as he had opened his institute. She was a dancer from the U.S., and she went and lived with Iyengar, and she was this incredible yoga teacher. She moved to Toronto because her husband at the time had a job in Canada. So she set up shop in her living room in Toronto, and I was her first student.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you just happened upon her?
I heard her name being mentioned at the Iyengar Center in Toronto, the established center. I heard them talking about this woman, and I sought her out. I heard her name, and then I found her name in the phone book, and then I started dropping in. She wouldn't return my phone calls.
See, that's so amazing to hear that, because whenever I start like a teacher training here, I always ask everyone, like, have you ever had any private yoga instruction? Nobody ever raises their hand.
Right.
Like maybe one or two now, sometimes because they know, but most of the time everybody's come to it from these group classes.
Yeah.
And I make a point of pointing out that, 50 or 60 years ago, there were no group classes.
Yeah.
If you wanted to learn yoga, you had to find a teacher. You had to seek them out. And you did.
I did.
You had to find her in the phone book.
I had to find her in the phone book.
And then convince her that you were a worthy student.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
She would not return my phone calls. So I started going to her door.
Oh, my gosh.
Knocking on her door. And 4 or 5 times she didn't answer. She maybe wasn't home.
She thought you were a stalker.
One day she answered the door. And she looked at me and she said, "What do you want?" And I said, Are you Lisa Schwartz? Do you teach yoga? And she said, "Who told you that?" And I said, "Well, I heard your name being mentioned." And she said, "Who? Who said that?" She was questioning me. And then I told her who, and I said, do you teach yoga? Am I at the right place? And she said, "I might." And she said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Whatever you're willing to show me." And she said, "You can come Sunday at 10 o'clock.
Wow. That's very similar to a story I have that I've told on this podcast before, where I met a Swami in India, and he asked me, "What do you want to learn?"
Right.
And I said, "Anything I don't already know."
Uh-huh.
Same kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? You're like, whatever you'll show me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I went Sunday morning at 10, and for the first few months, it was just me and her. And she would do her practice, and I would try to keep up.
So she would just practice, and you would practice along with her?
That was the deal. It wasn't like a real class.
Interesting.
And then I asked her if it would be okay for me to tell my friends, and could I start to bring a couple of people? And she said, "Yeah, as long as I like them."
Wow.
Yeah. So little by little.
Such a different dynamic. It's not like, I paid, now give me the yoga, right?
It wasn't like that.
No.
No, it wasn't like that with her.
Yeah. Okay, so how long did that go on?
That was like another 7 or 8 years.
Just practicing with her only?
Practicing with her only.
And did at some point she start to give you instruction, or did you always just follow along?
No, she definitely started to give instruction, and more people started to come.
And it grew.
And we started to learn these sequences from her that she had learned from Iyengar. And they were quite dynamic sequences. So she wasn't teaching tedious Iyengar yoga.
So it's interesting that you just said that, because the experience of Iyengar yoga a lot of times is like you get like 5 poses for the whole class.
Yeah.
Each one's got like a prop set up.
Yeah.
And so when you said tedious, I think that's sometimes where the tedium comes in, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So how is it different than that in your experience of
Well,
doing this woman? Lisa Schwartz, you said, right?
Lisa Schwartz. Iyengar used to do Ashtanga yoga when he was younger. And you've seen that old video of Iyengar.
Sure.
So Lisa learned dynamic sequences from Iyengar.
That's unusual, isn't it?
Well, I think that's the way he taught.
Or maybe back when.
Then.
Yeah.
So this would have been what, like 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that's how he was teaching.
And that's before Ashtanga really ever came into the scene.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Huh.
Yeah, there was no Ashtanga happening in Canada at that point.
No. Okay, so you were kind of doing a more vinyasa kind of practice with your Iyengar teacher?
That's right.
That's unusual.
I know.
Oh.
It's very unusual.
And do you think that she was there a lot of like her interpretation, her bringing things?
No.
Or was she doing what
she was doing exactly what she was taught.
Yeah.
And there were specific sequences. There were forward bending sequences, twisting sequences, inverted sequences, rope wall sequences.
Were there sun salutations?
Absolutely.
See, they don't teach. If you go to the Iyengar Center here in New York,
right.
you don't get any sun salutations.
No, I know. I've gone to lots of other Iyengar classes, and they're radically different from the Iyengar yoga I did with my teacher.
And do you have some sense of why that is? Like, is it because Iyengar became more codified and formalized into what we know it now, and back when maybe there was a little bit more free-formy to it?
Yeah, I think he was younger. He was he was practicing a different practice and teaching a different practice.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you go from this years of very intimate practice with a teacher in Iyengar, but vinyasa kind of style, and when do you part ways from her, or when do you end up doing a more formal Ashtanga vinyasa practice?
So then what happened was a friend of mine told me that there was a Bikram yoga studio opening in Toronto. We had never heard of it. It was the very first Bikram studio to open in Toronto. And my friend Soleil took me to a class there, and I liked it. I liked it. I liked the heat. I had just had a baby. I was breastfeeding at the tail end, and I liked the feeling of sweat and purging and detoxifying. I found it really a very good experience. So I went back, and he had not done his teacher training yet with Bikram. I don't know how he opened a Bikram studio without having done his teacher training. He did it, but then he had to leave shortly after to go and do his 3-month training, and he asked me to teach some classes for him.
Having never taught before.
Never having taught yoga before, and just having started with him like a month or two before.
But clearly he could see you had practiced.
I had more experience than anybody else in
Probably
the room.
him.
Maybe him.
Yeah,
maybe him.
Yeah.
So he talked me into it. I was not excited to do it. I was scared. I didn't think that I was ever going to be a yoga teacher. Had no intention.
But that's also another thing that I've often said to people, that when I first came in, and this was at the tail end, it seems like you're even a little ahead of me. I remember that the way you became a teacher, there weren't any teacher trainings.
Yeah, exactly.
It was just you showed up.
Yeah.
And you showed up consistently for long enough, and then at a certain point your teacher just turned to you and said, "You're ready. I need you to cover for me next week."
Yeah, he had to talk me into it.
Yeah.
And I did it as a favor. I liked the guy. So I showed up while he wasn't there. While I was teaching for him, I read an article in the Yoga Journal about Ashtanga yoga. So this was before the days of internet.
Okay.
Right? We didn't have computers then.
Information did not disseminate in the same way.
It was my Yoga Journal magazine that was my only connection to the yoga community.
Outside of your
Outside
neighborhood.
of my little class that I went to. And I waited every month. Like, I was excited for my Yoga Journal to arrive because I would get to read about these other teachers, and in particular the asana article in the journal used to be really, really detailed and in-depth, always written by Iyengar teachers, which I loved. And so this particular month, there was a full spread on Ashtanga yoga. And in the article, they interviewed Richard Freeman.
Amazing teacher. I practiced with him.
He was my main teacher in Ashtanga.
Oh,
Yeah.
I found him to be such an inspirational teacher when I met him.
So I was reading the article. I don't even think I got through the article, but I ordered the video, Richard's video.
Uh-huh.
And I also ordered a book called Power Yoga by Beryl Bender Birch.
Yes,
Those two, they both had ads in that journal, and I ordered both of those products.
So interesting, too, because to me, Richard Freeman kind of represents a very kind of authentic transmission of Ashtanga Vinyasa.
Yeah.
Beryl, she invented power yoga. She's the one who took it and kind of made it geared more towards runners.
Right.
So it's so interesting, you know. Those were your two sources.
Yeah, and I liked Beryl Bender's book. To
Yeah.
me, it was pretty much, it was all the information, but
Yeah.
it was the video, it was Richard's video that drew me in. And I watched it and watched it and I watched it, and I couldn't even believe what I was seeing, because up until that point, many of the poses he demonstrated in that video, I had only ever seen in pictures. I had never seen a moving body doing many of those postures. And so it was a huge eye-opener for me.
You see someone doing it, breathing is different than like the still image,
Very
right?
different.
Yeah.
Very different. So I watched the video for a while, and then I started practicing with the video.
Okay, so that's where you started practicing it off of with Richard on the video.
Exactly.
Wow.
And
And contrast that with your one-on-one instruction with Lisa Schwartz.
that's right.
Wow.
I was really, really wanting there to be a teacher where I lived, but there were no Ashtanga teachers anywhere to be found. There were no teachers in Canada. There were a few teachers here in New York, and there were a few teachers in LA, and a few teachers in Hawaii. But aside from those centers, there were no other teachers that I was aware of. So the video was the thing that I had, and that became my practice companion. After practicing for about a month with the video, I phoned the phone number on the box, and I left a phone message. And a few days went by, and Richard Freeman returned my phone call.
Amazing.
Amazing.
Amazing. Well, I did go to Boulder one time and take class with him, and it was later on, and I was shocked that he still had like the wooden box. Where
Right.
you just put
I
your
know.
money in and made the change. I could, you know what I mean? Like that. There used to be a time when all the classes were like that, but not anymore. Now it's
Yeah.
all like online registration.
That's right.
But back then, I remember going. He had the box, so he called you.
He
What did
called
he say?
me back. He said, "Hello,
Hello. Yeah.
this is Richard Freeman." And I freaked, completely freaked out, gathered myself, assembled myself, and I just started like with the questions.
Yeah.
What is this practice? Where did you learn? Where can I learn more? Where do you teach? Do you teach? What do I do? And he said, where are you calling from? I said, I'm calling from Toronto, Canada. And he said, is that anywhere near Niagara Falls? And I said, actually, it's very close. It's just about an hour and a half drive.
Okay.
And he said, well, I'll be in Niagara Falls next weekend. And I said, you're kidding. Like, what are you doing in Niagara Falls next weekend? He said, somebody has invited me to come and teach. This woman who I didn't know at the time read the same article and called Richard Freeman on a whim.
Wow.
And asked him if he would come and teach.
And he said yes.
And he said yes.
Yeah.
He was en route from Hawaii, and he said, sure, I can stop in and teach a weekend for these people in Niagara Falls. Well, it was for this organization called FOIT, and what it was an association for yoga teachers in southern Ontario. I had never heard of them because the Iyengar people have their own association. They're separate from everybody else.
Right.
They're doing their own thing.
Right.
So I had never heard of this other group. And he gave me a contact number. I called, I made plans to go, and I showed up at this. It was being held at a huge convent in Niagara Falls overlooking the falls.
Wow.
So Richard Freeman teaching Ashtanga yoga for about 100 people who had only ever done very, very gentle hatha yoga. How is this going to go over? Like, what the heck?
Did they all read the Yoga Journal article? Or?
No, just the one person
I see.
invited him to come. It was her job to find a guest teacher.
Uh-huh.
So she was the only one who knew anything about Ashtanga yoga.
Wow.
He shows up. There were no yoga mats to be found.
Yeah.
Everybody was practicing on their blankets.
Okay.
The blankets were not these like nice Mexican blankets or wool or cotton blankets.
No, like
they were
Manduka mats for us
slippery synthetic blankets.
Oh gosh. Not ideal for Ashtanga practice.
No, so it was a fascinating weekend because I observed Richard teaching all these people what Ashtanga yoga meant to him. And it
more than the primary sequence.
There was no primary sequence. It
Wow.
was modified sun series, a couple of standing poses. A little bit like the class you taught tonight. Simple.
See,
Not
that makes
too
sense
many.
to me because when I've talked to some people about like how, like, let's say a Mysore style Ashtanga practice might have happened in the past.
Yeah.
I've heard it described where you wouldn't try to do a full primary series the first time you ever came.
No.
That would never happen.
No.
You would do like some simple inhale arms up, exhale arms down kind of thing first. Maybe a simple forward bend vinyasa, and then they'd say, okay, come back tomorrow. Right? And then it would build over time. And then maybe at some point you'd be doing like a more full primary series. But it was kind of cultivated over time. It wasn't like you jumped in on the full primary the first time you ever did it.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's probably would make more sense that if you're going to try to teach Ashtanga to 100 people you've never met before, maybe you're not trying to do a full primary series.
It was very gentle, very slow. But the focus was on the Ujjayi breath.
Yeah.
He talked a lot about the bandhas.
Yeah.
And he taught a few poses in sequence.
Yeah.
And that was it, you know.
No jump backs?
No jump backs.
See, that's crazy
No
because
jump
Ashtanga's
backs.
known for the jump back.
He couldn't teach jump backs to these people.
They had slippery mats.
They would have been crippled. Yeah.
Wow. So what a great introduction, though, in a way.
It was an amazing introduction. But before the weekend was out, I asked him if he would guide me and a few of my friends who I'd brought through the primary series.
Right, because you've been doing it with the video.
I'd been doing it with the video. And he hummed and he hawed, and then he could tell how enthusiastic I was. And he said, okay, let's do it at the very end. So at the very end of the weekend, me and 6 of my friends were guided through the primary series by Richard. And it was transformative. I was absolutely mesmerized by the whole experience.
And so cool. Like, I've had a similar thing because now I have this video, this yoga video. So I've had this occasion where someone will buy that video and practice with it for like a while.
Right.
And then they'll show up here.
Right.
And it was filmed right here in this room.
Uh-huh.
And then they have it and they already know it.
Right.
It's so amazing, you know?
It's very cool.
So I can imagine that must have been special.
Yes, it was.
Mm.
And
then you were in Ashtanga from then on out, right?
So
you were sold.
I was sold.
Yeah.
But I was still teaching these Bikram classes for my friend.
Okay.
But he was coming home now from his training, like the next week. Mm-hmm. And
now it was all 26 poses and 2 breathing exercises.
Yeah.
No, script and all. Huh?
Yeah, script and all, which I was having a hard time following. I was already improvising a bit.
Yeah.
But while I was teaching these Bikram classes, this woman started coming to my class, and she was opening a studio in Toronto, and she was looking for teachers. And I said to her, well, I'm not a yoga teacher, so you're not looking at the right person. And she kept coming back to my class, and she talked me into teaching at her brand new studio.
Okay.
And she said, and you can teach whatever you want. And she said, you might, if you want to teach hot yoga, you should, I said, well, I'm not certified. And she said, oh, we'll just call it hot yoga. You can do whatever you want. I said, okay,
See,
great.
nobody cared about certification or any of that stuff back then, huh?
So I showed up to teach the first week her studio opened. It was the week after this weekend with Richard Freeman. And I walked in and I said to her, oh, and by the way, I'm going to show people just something a little bit different than what you've seen me teach. And she said, you can do whatever you want, Diane. Just whatever you want is fine with me. So, yeah, great. That's
Isn't that
just
nice?
great.
When the yoga center owner just gives you the complete freedom to teach whatever you want.
Whatever I want.
Nice.
So guess what I taught?
Ashtanga.
Ashtanga yoga.
You're like, I want to do that thing I did with Richard.
Yeah. So the first class, there were only 2 people in the class, and they were both my friends. I told them to come, and they came. And I began to show them the practice.
Yeah.
And it spread from there. So I was the first Ashtanga teacher in Canada.
Wow.
Wow.
That's a claim to fame.
That's hilarious,
so
right?
not only were you a senior, you were the first.
I was the first.
Okay.
And a few months after and the classes just got busier and busier fast.
Well, I mean, as in Canada, so everywhere else, I think.
It all happened all at
once. Ashtanga kind of hit the scene, that kind of aerobic aspect, or that, like you said, like me too, I had the same experience of a transformative experience through that flow and sweat and heat and movement, So I think it became very appealing to people in the yoga world very quickly and kind of took off, I remember.
And outside the yoga world.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yeah,
because now it became like, people who were interested in physical fitness.
That's what brought it into the gyms. Yeah. I remember when there wasn't any classes at gyms.
Right.
There wasn't any yoga classes
That's
at gyms.
right.
But once there was a more kind of athletic take on it, it fit perfect.
Yeah. So a few months after teaching these Ashtanga classes at the studio, someone showed up at my class one night. And I had just read an article about Sting doing yoga. Again, in the Yoga Journal. Still, we're talking no internet. This article came out. Sting was on the front cover.
And you know what's amazing? I'm sorry to jump in, but I remember that article because I was practicing at Jivamukti on 2nd Avenue, and that's where Sting had been practicing.
Right.
And so when that came out and everybody, like when they heard that Sting went to Jivamukti, that's when it became like you couldn't get into the 6:30 p.m. classes anymore. You had to like call in advance. And I started only going at like 10 and 12. I never went to the evening classes anymore.
Right.
So it started really getting mainstreamy, huh?
So the same thing happened in Toronto. A similar thing happened in Toronto. I read that article. The teacher who taught Sting, who introduced Sting to yoga, his name is Danny Paradise.
Oh, my God. I have taken a class with Danny Paradise.
Yay!
Just one.
Yay!
This is wow. This is a crazy story. See, I have an older brother who's like not a yoga person at all. And I got into yoga, and he had heard about it. And he was taking some classes in L.A. with Danny Paradise. And when I went to visit him, he took me to one class, I remember, in like like in the canyon or something. Wow. Okay. So that's a side.
So I remembered the name.
Okay.
I remembered the name, Danny Paradise. I just had read the article. It was beside my nightstand, beside my bed. And so I go in to teach my class at the studio, and the studio owner calls me over, and she says, "Diane, there's somebody here to see you." And I said, okay, great. Who's that? And she said, that guy standing over there. I said, oh, okay. She said, do you know him? I said, no, I don't know him. She said, his name is Danny Paradise. And my heart dropped. And I thought, oh my God, what is he doing here? What is he doing here? So I went over and I said, hi. And he said, yeah, I heard you were teaching Ashtanga yoga. I said, well, yeah, now I'm like, feeling a little bit embarrassed because I haven't really studied with a teacher, and I just learned from the video.
You told him that?
One weekend with Richard. Yeah, right away. I start telling him my whole story. And he said, is it okay if I watch you teach your class? And I said, oh, please teach the class for me.
Yeah.
oh, please don't watch me teaching the class. Yeah. Oh, no, I'm so nervous. No, you can't do it. He said, it's okay. It's cool. It's really cool. Like, no, I'd really like to just observe if that's okay. And I can't stay till the end because I have to leave. But just so you know, I'm leaving before the end.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what's happening? Like, are you staying in Toronto? Are you in town? Can we get together for a private? Like, I would love to learn from you. I need to talk to people about this. Like, I don't know what I'm doing.
I remember the same thing. Like, at a certain time, I didn't have anybody to talk to. And that's why I started writing, actually. It's like, I didn't have anybody to talk to. And you need to, like, get it out of my head.
Right.
So did he get together with you?
So he stayed. He watched 3/4 of the class. Then he left.
Okay.
And he said, well, I'm kind of busy. I might call you, but if I don't call you, next time I'm in town, I'll give you a ring.
Okay.
The next morning, he called.
Nice.
And I said, do you have time to get together? Can we get together? And he said, I have time later today. And I said, okay. Now I'm juggling for babysitters. I've got 2 little kids at home.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, what time? I'll be like, I'm going to make this happen.
Yeah.
So he came over to my house. We put our mats side by side. We went through the primary series together. He was looking at me out of the corner of his eye, didn't say a word.
Okay.
At the end of it all, he says, so how did you learn this? And I said, well, I told you, it's the video. And he said, really? The video? And I said, yeah, the video. I was a little embarrassed. And he said, you're doing really well.
Nice.
Keep it up.
Nice.
Good for you.
That's all you needed.
And that's all I needed.
That's all
it was
you
like
needed.
He gave me a major thumbs up, and he
Yeah.
was really proud of me and happy for me. And
Awesome.
that was really, really like just a huge boost. And exactly. Then I felt good about what I was doing.
Yeah.
And
so interesting how that can happen. I feel like that with one of my teachers too. I always say this to him, it's like, you gave me permission.
Yes.
And then he always laughs and goes, what did you need my permission for? But that's what it felt like.
when we're feeling a little insecure and we don't know,
Yeah.
it's really nice to have
Somebody acknowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Danny has been my friend ever since. So he was just in Toronto a few weeks ago. I went and took his class, and
Cool.
we hung out. And
All these many years later.
yeah, he comes to Toronto frequently. His parents lived in Toronto.
Okay.
And the funny thing is this, he ended up leaving me his contact information. A place in London, England, and his parents' house in Toronto. The address was number 1 Faith Avenue. And he didn't say anything at the time. He came over to my house, and I didn't know where he lived. He just wrote down his contact information before he left. Months went by, and I looked at this piece of paper, the back of my book, and I thought, where is that? And then I realized it was 3 blocks away from where I lived. And
You were neighbors.
And he never said, oh, what a coincidence.
Yeah.
I'm like right around the corner from you. So.
Wow. So
Yeah.
that's how you became the Ashtanga teacher that you became.
Well, I had, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how, and then it grew from there. So 2 years after that, another person I met who also read the same article and ordered the video was also practicing on his own. His name is Ron Reed. He started coming to my classes. We became friends. We ended up opening a studio in Toronto.
And what year was that?
That was in 97.
97.
Yeah.
And you opened an Ashtanga studio.
Yes, exactly. It was called the Downward Dog Yoga Center.
And did you teach lead classes, or was it all Mysore?
I taught lead classes. Ron did the Mysore classes.
I see. And so how long did that go, that center?
It still exists.
Okay.
It's still doing really, really well.
Okay.
I left 3 years ago.
Wow. So that's a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we actually get to kind of where
Right.
we started,
Right.
which is, when did it start to go south for you?
Well, it was a gradual progression. When I first started teaching a downward dog, I taught the primary series. And we noticed that a lot of people were getting injured. Their knees were being...
But not you, just other people.
Not me yet. Not me
not
yet.
that you were admitting yet.
No, I was still okay at that
okay.
point. But there were other people who had never done yoga before.
Yeah.
Showing up for classes. They had no experience at all.
Right.
Now doing primary series.
See, that's what I'm talking about, yeah.
So people started getting hurt right away. At which point we modified it. We modified the primary series.
Which not everyone's cool with.
I know.
Right. So that's a little bit sacrilege among some circles.
But
right?
there we were. We had a studio. We had rent to pay.
Yeah.
And we were clearly injuring people. So that was not okay.
Cool.
That was not okay. So we modified the primary series.
And what do you remember what some of those modifications were? I'm betting like less lotus.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Allowing people to not do,
certain things. Opt out or whatever.
Yeah, leave out Supta Karmasana and Merichasana D and
just not cranking people into stuff as much.
Exactly, but still cranking.
Still, because that's the Ashtanga way.
But still, and we loved it.
Yeah.
And,
I used to love strong, what they call adjustments.
Yeah.
Now.
Absolutely.
I don't do adjustments myself anymore.
Yeah.
That's getting ahead of ourselves. Please. So you were saying.
So we modified the primary series and continued to just, run classes. And then probably more like 5 or 6 years into it, I started to have a knee injury.
Okay.
And it got so bad that it was waking me up at night and keeping me up at night. The achy pain was really a drag.
Yeah.
And I put off going to a doctor.
Yeah.
And doctors are free in Canada. So usually,
wow, yeah. So you didn't have a good excuse.
Yeah, usually people run. You can run to the doctor for the littlest thing,
yeah.
And many people do. But it wasn't my style to do that, and I also didn't do that because I wanted to believe that my yoga practice was restructuring my body.
Yes. See, I had the same thing. I had pain in my knee.
Yeah.
And I had it in my mind that pain is just my body changing with the practice.
Yeah, me too.
For me, there was actually an acute moment where it like blew out.
Ah.
And like some third series pose I was cranking on, and I think it just popped.
Wow.
And then it was a huge epiphany. It was like super yogi can't walk.
Right.
I couldn't teach my classes and pay my rent.
Right.
It's like, I need this knee to work.
Yeah.
So you're waking up with pain at night.
Pain at night, not letting me go back to sleep at night. It was so bad. Finally, I went to the doctor.
Yeah.
The doctor says, okay, we're going to start with an ultrasound, and if we have to do an MRI, we will. But let's see what we see in the ultrasound. The results came back, and I had a huge cyst in my knee.
Okay.
She said, oh, this is an unusual injury. I don't think I've ever actually seen anything quite like this before. I was expecting it to be my meniscus, just like everybody else's meniscus. That was popping and snapping, right? And all the knee injuries tended to be meniscus tears.
Right.
So this was unusual. And she said to me, I have a feeling that it's related to too much friction in your joint. And aren't you the yoga teacher? I said, yeah.
Your fame preceded you.
I'm the yoga teacher. And she said, I would suggest that you stop doing anything that causes any pain.
Yes.
Whoa.
So pain is the barometer.
It wasn't. It hadn't been up until that point. Yeah. Pain was, something that
was opening.
Yeah. It was what we were going for. If it didn't,
the more sensation, the more open I was getting.
Yeah, the better it was. So it meant that I could not take my knee into full flexion because it hurt. That hurt. So I'm just sitting like this with my knee bent. I couldn't do this.
Right.
When my knee was injured, I could only bend it like a little bit more than 45 degrees.
Okay.
And then it hurt. So that eliminated
a whole range of poses
pretty
from
much
primary.
all of the seated postures that I was teaching.
Yeah.
All the modified primary series postures were now couldn't demonstrate.
Yeah.
And aside from that, my heart
Burst.
was crying. I was like, wow.
What am I going to do?
Yeah. How do I go on?
You got classes to teach.
I got classes to teach. I got a
Expectations.
reputation to live up to.
Yeah.
So I shifted gears. And the common advice at the time was the reason I injured my knee was because my hips were not open enough.
The one I got was you didn't have good enough alignment. If I had better alignment, it wouldn't have happened. Yeah.
Mine was your hips aren't open enough.
Oh, I see. So you tried to open your hips more?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, yeah.
See, and nowadays, like, I won't even use the word hip opener.
Well, yeah, well, we've learned.
There's nothing about my hip that I necessarily want to open.
Yeah.
And you did.
I wanted to open my hips desperately because
you thought that would help your knee.
Exactly. So I started doing a lot of hip openers, and I started teaching a lot of hip openers. So we, continue to keep the classes extremely challenging, very, very challenging, pushing people to the max, not doing half lotus, leaving that out because I couldn't demonstrate it. But all the other stuff that I could demonstrate and push myself into, I pushed my students into. And we just carried on for another 5 or 6 years down that road.
Like pushing as hard as you could without hurting your knees.
Exactly. So my knee healed.
Okay.
My knee healed. Every once in a while, I would want to go back and do the primary series just to see.
And they would twinge, and you'd be like, oh!
Well, it was interesting. It was like I could do it again, but then if I did it too many times in 1 week, it would start to ache again, and then I go, okay, stop.
Yeah.
These are the signs.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.